In this video, we're going to talk about the security planning and setup stage of implementing Yurbi. And if you're looking at this as part of our Getting Started series and you're just doing a trial, you don't have to do this at this particular moment in your trial. But it is important to understand these concepts so that you can start to think about them and how they can apply in your environment. What we're going to cover today is we're going to go over the different levels of security that exist in Yurbi. I'm going to actually take you into the product and show you at a high level where those components are configured. But we're going to do more tactical things in a later video. But in this planning course, we're going to take a look at the setup process, some of the best practices, and we're going to talk about examples that we'll cover later. So let's jump right in. Now, Yurbi is designed to be a very secure application, and in fact, there's four different levels of security: authentication, access, role-based, and data level. And honestly, within each of these, I could break it out into even more levels, but I've compressed a couple of things into these four. Let's go over each of the four so you understand what's meant by these in the Yurbi nomenclature. Authentication. That's going to be the very first level, and that's going to essentially be, can someone log into Yurbi or not? We have the concept of a secure user and a guest user. As you can imagine, secure users have a login and password, and the key distinction is when you have a user login and password, that means that within Yurbi you have a user profile. And guess what we do with that user profile? That's where each individual user can save their own preferences, can save views at the dashboard level, prompts at the prompt panel level in the dashboard. We also are going to be able to audit and track everything that that user does in terms of what reports they're running and creating and deleting and exporting of data and things like that. And we're also going to be able to apply dynamic security so that two people can log in and look at the exact same dashboard or report but see only the data that they're allowed to see. Lastly, a secure user can get a scheduled email because as we send that user that email, we're going to run them through that dynamic security to make sure we're only emailing them what they should have access to. Now, if you're not logging in, then you're a guest user. And the only thing that the guest user can do is they can view any reports that you've applied a public view document license to. So if you've deemed a report to be public view, then essentially anyone with access to that report can view it, whether you give them a direct link to the report or you embed it inside another web page. But those are guest users. Guest users they're anonymous. We can't track who they are. We can't apply dynamic security. We can't save any preferences that they might have. We can't send them an email. But they can do a lot of the power of what a normal user can do outside of that. Now, the last thing I want to say about authentication is how do they authenticate? Well, there's a couple different ways. You can set them up to have a PIN based, where you define a passcode for them to log in with. You can, if you're using Active Directories, then you can set up Windows authentication so they can use their network login and password and they can log in, and you can even set that up to be pass through authentication. And if you're in a embedded analytics scenario, then our preferred method would be that you use a session token based authentication where your application calls our API, gets a session token for that particular user, and then you could pass that across Yurbi to do single sign on and to seamlessly log them in. So that's authentication. That's if they can log in or not. Now, the key thing to know about authentication, just because they can log in doesn't really give them access to do much of anything. The second level of control is called access. And that's going to be what specific Yurbi apps they have access to communicate with. What data source? Think of a Yurbi app as a data source. What data sources can they talk to? If you don't give them any access permission, then they can't talk to your backend data. So without access, so for example, if you had multiple databases and you had a whole bunch of reports created from database number one and database number two, if someone only has access to database number one, they will never even know that the reports for database number two even existed. So that access enables, not just the ability to communicate with a data source, but also the ability to see things that have been created from that data source. What's nice about the Yurbi model is Yurbi is the only thing that talks to the data source. So as you create these users and you give them explicit access permission to that data source, you can also take it away quickly as well. And you don't have to worry about removing any user IDs or passwords at the database level. So you've got one place to give that explicit permission to a data source. So that's the access level of control. So once somebody can log into Yurbi, then you say what particular data sources they have permission to talk to. The next level is role based. So you've given them, let's say in the concept of an app, you've given them permission to talk to an app, but the next level of security is, well, what can they do with that app or that data source? So from a role-based permission on the apps, you've got the view-only permission, you've got the ability for people to build from that data source, and then you've got the ability for people to be the architect or to be able to get into the actual database schema level to look at the raw tables and the raw fields. So that's the third level of security is what role do they have to your particular data source? And there's a screenshot here that will show you the configuration of that. And I'm going to log you into the product in a second and show you this as well. There's also another aspect of role-based security, and that's going to be in the library and folder and the report access. So there's the concept of roles that apply to the actual data source. What can they do at the data source level? There's also roles in terms of folder and document management in the library, and those are aligned more with view, modify, delete, admin. So as you create a group and you want that group to have read-only access, they can't delete a report, they can't delete a folder, they can't move things out of a folder. Maybe they can't write and create new things in that folder. And maybe they can see a folder, but inside that folder are certain reports. Some reports they can edit, and some reports they can't. You could do all those sorts of scenarios with the group roles of view, modify, delete. And there's admin or none. Those are really just two things that are there for clarity. If you want to explicitly say someone has no permission, you can check the none. But honestly, if you don't check any boxes, it's none by default. If you give someone delete, it's admin by default. So just a little note on that. Now, the last level of security is the data level security itself, row level security. So even though they can have access to Yurbi, they can talk to a particular data source, they can build or view a particular report, and they have permission to see that report in order to run it. The last level of security is that data level security is going to dynamically control what they see, the data that's returned inside that report. So this is a very personal configuration where maybe I can only see my department or my customer or my tenant, or maybe I can only see my location or my tickets or whatever that configuration might be. Data level allows the same individuals to look at the same exact report or dashboard and see only what you want them to see. So those are the four levels. Now, builders, as you build a report, you can hard code data level security. You can build it into the report criteria, and that's what you're going to do if you do a public facing document. If you do one of those guest view documents that a guest user, anonymous user can look at, you would hard code that security at the criteria level of a particular report. But what's nice about our the app shield, as it's called, is with data level security is dynamically applied. So one report doesn't have to be hard coded, but can still have that level of security control. So now let's take a quick look. I'm going to switch over and take a look at my at Yurbi and show you where these things are located. Okay, I'm logged into Yurbi. I'm going to first let's talk about access control. It's going to be under admin and permissions. And if they don't have a user ID here, then they're not going to be able to log into Yurbi. So when they don't have a login defined here, and they don't have a PIN or the Windows authentication we talked about, then that's the access level. They can't do anything from that point. Now also within the permissions, you determine your access level. If I scroll down, you'll see the app assignment section. This is where for every semantic layer, every app you have, you can give them access to that individual Yurbi app or not. And then that gets us into the third category, which was the role-based security. So here you'll see that there are roles within the app. We talked about the builder, the agent, and the architect. And I can explicitly, give this particular user builder and give different users different control to different semantic layers. And then there's that role-based security that exists at the group level. And here you'll see that none, admin, view, modify, delete. So I can create a set of groups here that will control what they can do at the report and the library aspect. Let's take a look at that so you can see how that looks. In the library, if I were to look at a specific folder and go into the configuration of that folder, you'll see that there are groups that I can assign to specific folders. So that's where the groups apply at the folder level. And if I were to take a look at a specific report, let's just go ahead and edit one of these reports. There's also a layer of group permissions at the individual report level. So if I were to go into report options, or when you save a report, you'll be able to set up groups that apply to a particular report. So that gives you a lot of flexibility. And we're going to talk about that flexibility in a second, but that gives you a lot of flexibility on who can see and do what to a specific report and who can see and do what to a specific library folder. And the two don't have to be connected. They can be totally separate. Now, the last thing that we talked about was data level security. Let's go back to admin. That's going to be here in your data security area. And this is where you could set up policies and constraints against any app and report type. And you can assign those again to those groups. So that's the concept of a data security group. So there's really two types of groups you can set up. There's the folder security group, there's the report security group, and now we're talking about a data security group. They could all be collapsed into one, or they could be separated into different ones. Or in this policy security, data security, I can assign specific users. So you have the benefits of both sections there. All right, so that's the high level look. We'll go into very, very tactical and discrete looks at examples later, but that's what we want to cover today for the overview. Now let's go back and talk about how we plan for these different levels of security. So first, let's talk about best practices. And best doesn't mean it's best for your organization. Every organization is unique. Best just means that generally these are good things to follow. But again, every organization is unique. So we can help you if you have any questions about this. Now I mentioned that we talked a lot about how these permissions can kind of be expanded into a lot of different things, like the data security groups and the folder groups and the report groups. The system's designed to be extremely flexible in order to meet the most complicated requirements, but also to meet the easiest and the smallest requirements. So you don't want to overcomplicate things. You want to keep things simple. For example, you might want to have builders that have limited access to data. This is very common in a multi-tenant type of environment where a customer can talk into your data source, but they should only see their own data. That's a builder that has limited access to data. We don't see this scenario very often, but our security was designed to handle it. You might have read-only and view-only users that you want to manage your libraries. This is a very decentralized form of management where maybe you have departments and you have a library manager at the department. They can't build new reports. They can't delete reports, but maybe they can create new folders and move things between folders and kind of do folder management. You could do that. You could set up a read-only user that has the ability to manage the shared folders, maybe just for their team or just for their tenant. So again, lots of complex, unique type requirements. You can do that in the Yurbi model. Now, one very important thing is by default, out of the box, when you start your trial, only authentication and access are enforced. So authentication means, yeah, you have to create a user to log in and you have to give them access to a data source for them to do anything. But by default, all users with access to a particular data source or a Yurbi app, they're going to be able to see all the data coming out of that database. If you don't set up any data level security constraints, then they'll be able to talk to any data that's in that database that you give them permission to through the app. The other thing is the library, and this is actually the more important thing to take note of, is anybody with access to that Yurbi app will be able to see everything in that library related to that Yurbi app, and in addition, they'll be able to move and delete it, and they'll have full rights and permissions to those folders and those documents. That's the default state because for the majority of users, it's a small team use case environment. Everything is shared. So by default, you create a report, everybody's going to have access to the same data, and everybody can go in and start to move it and delete it and mess it up. That's a bad thing in some cases. Change control is important. You probably don't want users accidentally deleting your production reports. So we're going to talk about some of the things you do to make sure that doesn't happen in this planning session. Now let's talk about how we plan security. There's three areas that you want to plan for. There's the who's accessing Yurbi and what roles do they have to your various Yurbi apps and data sources. You're going to need to know who's logging in, what their login ID is going to be, what their PIN or password is going to be, or if you're using Windows authentication. You're going to need to know what data sources, what Yurbi apps they have access to. So if you have just one, that's a simple planning process. If you have multiple databases, then you're going to have to map those users to those particular apps. And then you're going to want to know what can they do with that data source. Can they build, or can they view, or can they architect? And maybe there's an admin. So, you always have the admin user type as well. So that's going to be the first thing. Who's going to have access? What can they talk to? And what can they do? Answer those three questions. The next thing, this middle block here, is folder and report security groups. So you want to list out all the groupings of your users by the requirements for, what should they see and what kind of control should they have. In a small environment, this is very simple. We have users that can modify and we have users that can read only. Pretty simple. You just need one group for that. We'll talk about that in a second. But maybe you have more complexity. I've got departments. I want HR department to have a segment that they can see and have a read-only set of HR members and a modified set of HR members or builders. And then I have an IT department. Then I have a customer support department. Maybe I have East Coast, West Coast. I have store locations. Whatever it might be, you want to think about across the board. Is there a common control and visibility standard, read only versus modify, or do you need to get distinctions on who can do what? So that's where you set up your folder report and security groups. And I gave you some examples here so you can kind of see examples. These groupings also might be by components in the product. You might say, okay, these people I want to delineate who can have access to what in the library. I want to delineate what reports they can have access to, and also at the dashboard level. So you could do groups for that. And this will make a little bit more sense once we start doing some exercises. And then the last set of security that you want to plan for is data level security. Again, you want to list out all those groupings. This is different than folder report and security is just what they can access and what they can do with it. Can they see something, and then can they just view only, modify, or delete? That's what that middle section is. This last one is what data can they see. We're assuming at this point they can see the report. Now that they can see the report, when they run it, what do they see inside the report? What's the data? And this is where you got to think about your level of data scoping. Is it at the tenant level? Is it department level? Is it location based level? Is it, all different sorts of levels that every organization might have? And I'll give you some examples on that as well. So you can kind of see that this can blow out really large, or it could be really simple depending on your needs. And again, if you need help with it, we have a professional services team very experienced in setting this up for organizations. Now the order is kind of it's not super important. I mean, I actually put here there's no right way or wrong way. But if you do the planning process, then there is a way that you can go faster and quicker. If you do mess this up, it's not a terrible situation. You can easily just reset it up. It's just moving the mouse and clicking buttons. It's not too difficult. But I will say, if you do have hundreds of users, moving the mouse and clicking the button can be quite tedious. That's where doing mass modifications through our API can be needed. And those are always custom type of scripts that need to be created against the API. in particular, most likely our SOAP based API. And that's where our professional services team can help you with that. But the recommended order is create your library control and visibility groups first, then your report ones, then your data security, and then add in your users. Most people actually do the opposite. They start immediately adding in the users, and the only group that they have is the all users group, and basically all the initial reports that they build are available and open to everybody by default, and then they have to go back and retrofit everything. And that's why I say if you do this planning up front, things will move a little bit smoother. And while I specifically say create library, then create report, and then create data security, in reality, for your organization, all those might be compressed into just one group. And I'll show you a simple example here in a second where that's the case. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're creating three groups per user community and things like this. It could just be one simple group. But the concept is you've planned and you thought about within that group, this is the scope. Everything can be handled in a view, modified, delete capacity within those groups. Now, best practices. And we're almost close to the end of this video. One, keep it simple as possible. I kind of hinted with great power can come complete confusion. You can really overthink this. You can really start to build too many groups and subgroups, thinking of every possible permutation and use case. My advice: keep it simple and then grow it and expand it as you need to later once those realities present themselves. Uh, Second best practice is this flows with keeping it simple, but you really don't want to have a user in more than about three groups. Every time we execute a report, we have to check and validate what security groups they're part of in order to dynamically apply that security. And if you put them in too many distinct groups, then that's adding milliseconds of processing time every time they do something. And that can really delay from a click to execute a report until they get results. So you want to streamline this as much as possible. And again, that's where really putting the planning. It takes time to do something in a simple fashion takes more planning than to do something in a complex fashion. Next best practice is to use naming conventions and the description fields in all of your groups and security areas, your data policy. Be sure to really describe what it is you're doing and trying to accomplish. And if you are using certain groups for library permissions and certain groups for report permissions or dashboard permissions or data security permissions, use a common nomenclature so that when you look at the groups list, you know exactly what their purpose is. And when you create a new user, it's very easy to say, okay, I want to put them in the East Coast read only report group and the non-manager data security group. So you might, and I'll show you an example where you kind of have a prefix that kind of designates the type of group that it is. And then last best practice, as part of keeping it simple, generally agents will always get view. I mean, it's very non-typical environment where the agent does more than just read only. Agents are view only. Builders typically get modify only as a best practice. And the reason I say that is only allow your admins to delete things out of the team library, the shared library. And that'll save you a lot of heartache if somebody accidentally comes in and deletes something that you didn't attend. Now that can there's it's a double-edged sword when you do that because builders make mistakes, people make mistakes, they copy something and have a duplicate file sitting out there they want to get rid of. If they don't have permission to fix their own mistake and delete it themselves, they're frustrated. They got to go back to an admin and say, hey, can you delete this out of this folder? But that little process and that little necessary frustration will save you a tremendous amount of more frustration than if somebody accidentally comes in and deletes a whole bunch of folders and reports, and the only avenue you have to do at that point is to restore from the most recent backup and potentially lose things since that backup was taken. So I would just recommend as a best practice that leave delete in all your groups to an admin user, and then builders can get modify, of course, so they can modify things. And in some cases, you might even want to limit that. So that's an example of how you can leverage security. Now, we're going to dive deep into these scenarios in the next few sections. So I'm not going to cover them here. We're going to do these hands on so you can actually see the setup of this. And this will really help you with both the planning process and the implementation process of how to do that. But just to kind of show you a scenario we're going to do a very simple setup. This is going to probably be fine for most of the internal business use cases that you have, especially if it's just a small number of users, maybe one app being connected to and things like that. That's going to be what we call the simple setup. And then we're going to do more of a department level setup where we have the concept of departments and we have the concept of read only and modification needs and managers and non manager data access needs. So we're going to start to combine all these things together. Top three takeaways. One, planning makes it simple. That's why we emphasize planning when it comes to security and security groups, because if you don't plan, then it becomes complex and it becomes really not fun to manage as you grow. So if you spend the time planning and you do the naming conventions and things like that, everything becomes much more easier, and that's what we're all about here: low cost of operations and maintenance. Takeaway number two is limit your users to 1 to 3 group assignments. Don't want them really going out beyond that because you're going to start to see the impact from a processing perspective. And just to recap what I said at the very beginning, if you're doing a trial and you just really want to get quickly into building reports and seeing that, just save this for later when you get into production planning mode. For trial purposes, it's wild, wild west. Just build some reports, save them. Everybody can do whatever. You probably don't have a lot of users in your trial. It's just you experimenting with the product yourself. So none of this is essential for a trial. You can use it out of the box as is, with the caveat that the role based and the data level security is open to everyone who looks at that report. All right. If you do have any questions, you can reach us at support.yurbi.com and stay tuned for the next video in this series.